The federal agents were already waiting in the parking lot when Vincent Cross and his 7-year-old son arrived at the rope factory for the second time, their black SUVs positioned in a way that blocked the only exit, the kind of deliberate placement that said nobody was leaving until they got answers to questions Vincent didn't even know he should be asking. He'd owned the property for exactly 36 hours, had spent maybe 4 of those hours inside the building, and already men with badges were treating him like he'd stumbled into something that went deeper than an abandoned factory in rural Pennsylvania. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Vincent's first instinct was to turn the truck around, to drive away from whatever this was and pretend he'd never placed that desperate bid at the county foreclosure auction. But his son Jamie sat beside him in the passenger seat, his small hands gripping the backpack that held everything they owned that mattered, and running meant abandoning the only roof they had any claim to. The apartment eviction was final, the storage unit where their furniture sat was 3 months overdue, and Vincent's bank account showed $17 after he'd paid the $435 for a building nobody else wanted. "Dad, why are there police cars?" Jamie asked, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a child who'd learned to expect complications. "I don't know yet, buddy. But we're going to find out together." Vincent parked away from the federal vehicles, his construction worker's instincts telling him to assess a situation before walking into it. The rope factory sat on 8 acres at the edge of Mill Creek, a town that had thrived when American manufacturing meant something and had slowly deflated when factories closed and jobs disappeared. The building itself was massive, 4 stories of brick and timber built in 1903 to produce rope for everything from shipping to farming to industrial use. The structure had closed in 1992 when synthetic materials made natural fiber rope obsolete for most applications. Since then, it had sat abandoned, accumulating tax liens and structural problems that made conventional buyers avoid it. Vincent had found the auction listing while researching any property he could possibly afford, had driven out to look at it once, and had convinced himself that walls and a roof were walls and a roof even if they came with complications. 2 men in dark suits approached as Vincent got out of the truck, their credentials already visible. FBI, not local police, which meant whatever this was had crossed state lines or involved federal jurisdiction. The older agent was maybe 50, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades asking questions people didn't want to answer. "Vincent Cross?" the agent asked. "That's me. Special Agent David Harmon, FBI. This is Agent Chen. We need to talk about what you found in the rope factory." Vincent felt his stomach drop. He'd explored maybe a quarter of the massive building yesterday, had discovered the vault in the sub-basement level purely by accident while checking the foundation for structural damage. The vault door had been concealed behind 70 years of accumulated debris, its presence completely unknown until Vincent had moved old equipment and found it. "I haven't opened anything," Vincent said carefully. "Found the vault, took pictures, was planning to contact the locksmith to see what it would take to access it legally." Agent Harmon's expression didn't change. "The vault you found is connected to a federal investigation that's been cold for 53 years. We'd like to discuss this inside, away from public view." Vincent glanced at Jamie, who was watching through the truck window with wide eyes. "My son can wait in the vehicle with Agent Chen while we talk. This won't take long if you cooperate." The word cooperate carried weight, the implication that non-cooperation was an option but not a good one. Vincent told Jamie to stay in the truck, followed Agent Harmon into the rope factory through the main entrance he'd forced open yesterday with a crowbar and determination. Inside, the building was vast and overwhelming in the way abandoned industrial spaces always were. The main production floor stretched out like a cathedral to manufacturing, 3 stories of open space beneath a ceiling supported by timber beams that had been cut from old-growth forests over a century ago. Massive rope-making machines still sat in rows, the equipment used to twist natural fibers into cordage of various sizes and strengths. The smell hit Vincent the same way it had yesterday, dust and mildew and the ghost of hemp and sisal fibers that had been processed here for 90 years. Light filtered through broken windows and gaps in the roof, illuminating particles that danced in the air like memories of work that had stopped 3 decades ago. Agent Harmon led him through the production floor to the stairs that descended to the sub-basement level, the area where Vincent had found the vault while checking foundation walls for water damage. The space was darker, cooler, carved partially into bedrock that predated the building itself. The vault sat against the north wall, concealed behind old equipment that Vincent had moved yesterday. It was old, maybe from the 1940s, a serious piece of engineering designed to protect whatever it contained from fire, flood, and unauthorized access. Vincent had photographed it, documented its location, but hadn't attempted to open it because he had no combination and no legal authority to force entry. "Tell me exactly how you found this," Harmon said. Vincent explained his exploration of the building, his systematic assessment of structural integrity, his discovery that the sub-basement had been deliberately filled with old equipment and debris in a way that suggested intentional concealment rather than casual storage. "I moved some of the machinery, found the vault, took pictures. Didn't try to open it because I figured whatever was inside belonged to the previous owner's estate or had legal complications I couldn't afford to get involved in." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Harmon studied Vincent for a long moment, apparently deciding whether to believe him. "What do you know about the rope factory's history?" Built in 1903, operated by the Mercer family for 3 generations, closed in 1992 when the market shifted. That's about it. The Mercers were more than rope manufacturers. During World War II, they had contracts with the Navy, produced specialized cordage for military applications. After the war, they continued working with the Department of Defense on classified projects. Harmon pulled out a tablet, showed Vincent photographs. In 1971, the factory was involved in a federal investigation. The owner at the time, Douglas Mercer, was suspected of using his manufacturing operation to smuggle contraband. The investigation was building toward indictments when Mercer died in an industrial accident. Vincent looked at the photographs, seeing a serious-faced man in work clothes standing in front of the rope factory in what appeared to be the 1960s. Douglas Mercer had the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent his life working with his hands, his expression revealing nothing about whether he'd been running a smuggling operation alongside his legitimate business. "What kind of contraband?" Vincent asked. "That's still classified. What matters now is that when Mercer died, the investigation stalled. Federal agents searched the factory but never found what they were looking for. The business limped along for another 20 years under Mercer's widow before finally closing." Harmon paused. "The vault you found was never mentioned in any of the property records. We didn't know it existed until your discovery triggered an alert in our database." "How did my discovery trigger anything?" "I haven't told anyone except my son. The photographs you took were automatically backed up to cloud storage. Our monitoring systems flagged the vault's distinctive features, matched them to classified files about the 1971 investigation." Harmon's expression was neutral but his voice carried an edge. "You stumbled into something that's been buried for 50 years. Now we need to know what's in that vault." Vincent felt the ground shifting beneath this conversation, understanding that he'd accidentally become involved in something far more complicated than buying an abandoned factory. "I don't have the combination. Even if I wanted to open it, I couldn't. We have specialists who can open it. What we need from you is consent to access property you legally own, and cooperation with our investigation of whatever we find inside." "And if I refuse?" Harmon's pause was deliberate. "Then we obtain a warrant, which delays the process and makes your legal status more complicated. Warrants raise questions about whether you're impeding a federal investigation, whether your purchase of this property was coincidental or connected to knowledge about what it contained." The threat was barely veiled. Vincent could cooperate and maintain some control over the situation, or he could resist and watch federal agents take over the property he'd bought with money he desperately needed for other purposes. The choice wasn't really a choice, just the illusion of agency in a situation where power flowed entirely in one direction. "I'll cooperate," Vincent said. "But I want everything documented. Whatever you find, whatever happens, I want legal protection that I'm just the property owner who happened to discover this, not someone involved in whatever Mercer was doing. That can be arranged. Assuming what we find supports your story. Over the next 3 hours, Vincent watched federal agents transform the rope factory's sub-basement into a crime scene or archaeological dig or whatever category applied to opening a vault that had been sealed for over 50 years. Specialists arrived with equipment, photographers documented everything, and Agent Harmon maintained a presence that made clear this was federal jurisdiction now regardless of who owned the property. Jamie waited in the truck with Agent Chen, who'd apparently been assigned babysitting duty. Vincent checked on his son periodically, finding him reading a library book about space exploration, processing the strangeness of federal agents with the resilience kids developed when their lives were unstable enough that nothing was truly surprising anymore. "Are we in trouble?" Jamie asked during one check-in. "No, buddy. Just complicated. We found something in the building that the government is interested in, but we didn't do anything wrong." "Is it treasure?" Vincent thought about how to answer that. "I don't know yet. Might be something else. We'll find out together." By late afternoon, the specialists had the vault open. Vincent wasn't allowed to observe the actual opening, was kept at a distance while agents worked. But he saw their reactions when the door swung open, saw the sudden intensity of communication, the way Agent Harmon's expression shifted from professional neutrality to something harder to read. Harmon emerged 20 minutes later, his demeanor changed in subtle ways. "Mr. Cross, we need to have a longer conversation about this property and your intentions for it. What was in the vault?" "I can't discuss that in detail yet. What I can tell you is that you've discovered something significant to an ongoing federal investigation. The contents are being secured and transported for analysis." Harmon paused. "This factory is now a federal crime scene. We'll need access for at least the next 72 hours, possibly longer." Vincent felt panic rising. "This is the only property I have. My son and I are living here because we have nowhere else to go. You can't just lock me out of the building I legally own." "We're not locking you out. We're restricting access to the sub-basement level while we process evidence. The rest of the factory remains available to you." Harmon's expression softened slightly. "I understand this is difficult. You bought an abandoned building hoping for shelter, and instead you found yourself in the middle of a federal investigation. But what's in that vault is important enough that we can't walk away." After the agents left, taking whatever they'd found in the vault with them and leaving crime scene tape around the sub-basement entrance, Vincent sat in the rope factory's old office space with Jamie beside him. The building felt different now, its vast spaces holding secrets that had drawn federal attention, its history more complicated than simple industrial decline. "What did they take?" Jamie asked. "I don't know. They wouldn't tell me." Vincent pulled out his phone, looking at the photographs he'd taken before backing them up to cloud storage, before accidentally triggering whatever federal monitoring system had brought the FBI to his doorstep. The vault in the photographs looked innocuous, just an old safe in a sub-basement that had probably been used for important documents or cash. But federal agents didn't mobilize teams and classify contents unless what they'd found mattered in ways that went beyond local crime or simple historical curiosity. Vincent thought about Douglas Mercer, about a rope manufacturer who'd died in an industrial accident while under federal investigation for smuggling. About a vault that had been deliberately concealed, that had remained hidden through 3 decades of abandonment, that had yielded something important enough to bring the FBI within hours of its discovery. He thought about the timing of Mercer's death in 1971, about investigations that stalled when their primary target died conveniently, about secrets that stayed buried until desperate single fathers buying foreclosed factories accidentally uncovered them. As evening settled over Mill Creek and the rope factory stood silent in the fading light, Vincent realized he'd bought more than an abandoned building. He'd bought Douglas Mercer's final secret, had inherited a mystery that the federal government had been unable to solve for 53 years, had become the unexpected curator of whatever evidence or contraband or classified materials that vault had protected. The factory waited in the darkness, its brick walls holding stories that had just begun to reveal themselves, its sub-basement now secured by federal crime scene tape, its new owner sitting in an old office with his 7-year-old son wondering what exactly he'd stumbled into and whether the $435 he'd paid was going to cost him more than money he didn't have. Outside, Mill Creek breathed in the autumn night, a town that had seen factories close and populations decline, that had watched its industrial heritage become ruins in tax sales. The rope factory had been part of that decline, had sat abandoned for 3 decades while secrets stayed sealed in vaults nobody knew existed. Now those secrets were emerging, carried away in federal vehicles, analyzed by specialists, connected to investigations that predated Vincent's birth. And he stood at the center of something he didn't understand, holding legal ownership of a building that had just become far more complicated than shelter from eviction. The vault's contents were gone, but its implications remained, settling onto Vincent's shoulders like weight he hadn't asked for and couldn't refuse. Whatever Douglas Mercer had hidden in 1971, whatever had killed him or caused his convenient death, whatever the FBI had been searching for since before Vincent was born, all of it was now connected to a desperate father who'd bought an abandoned rope factory because he had nowhere else to go. Agent Harmon returned 72 hours later, but this time he wasn't alone. He brought a woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Elizabeth Mercer Whitfield, Douglas Mercer's daughter, and her presence changed everything Vincent thought he understood about why the FBI was interested in a vault that had been sealed since 1971. "My father died protecting something he believed was more important than his own life," Elizabeth said, standing in the rope factory's main floor where Douglas had once supervised workers making cordage for ships and farms and industrial machinery. "I've spent 53 years wondering what was worth dying for. Now, because of you, I finally have answers." Vincent had spent the past 3 days researching everything he could find about Douglas Mercer in the 1971 investigation. Newspaper archives painted a picture of a respected manufacturer who'd operated the rope factory for 23 years, who'd employed over 100 workers at the operation's peak, who'd died at 51 when he fell from a 4th-floor maintenance platform in what was ruled an industrial accident. But reading between the lines of those old articles, Vincent found hints of something darker. References to ongoing federal inquiries, mentions of Mercer's controversial business practices, speculation about Navy contracts that involved classified work. The rope factory had been more than a simple manufacturing operation, and Douglas Mercer's death had been convenient for someone. What was in the vault? Vincent asked, the question he'd been asking for 3 days without getting answers. Elizabeth looked to Agent Harmon, who nodded permission. "Documents. Ledgers. Evidence my father compiled about a smuggling operation he'd stumbled into accidentally while fulfilling Navy contracts in the late 60s. He wasn't the criminal the investigation suggested, he was trying to expose one." She pulled out a folder, spread photographs across a makeshift table Vincent had set up in the old office space. The images showed documents in Douglas Mercer's handwriting, detailed records of shipments and contacts and transactions that had nothing to do with rope manufacturing. "During the Vietnam War, my father's factory produced specialized cordage for military applications. That work gave him access to shipping networks and cargo manifests that most civilian manufacturers never saw. He started noticing irregularities, containers that didn't match their listed contents, shipments that disappeared from official records, money moving through channels that made no sense for legitimate commerce." Vincent studied the photographs, seeing meticulous documentation of what appeared to be a massive smuggling operation using military supply chains as cover. He was gathering evidence to expose this. He was trying to figure out who to trust. The smuggling involved people in positions of authority, possibly within the agencies that were supposed to prevent it. "My father didn't know who was corrupt and who was clean." Elizabeth's voice carried decades of suppressed anger. "So he compiled everything in secret, hid it in that vault, and was killed before he could decide what to do with it." Agent Harmon spoke up. "The 1971 investigation was real, but it was also cover. We now believe it was initiated by the people Mercer was preparing to expose, designed to discredit him before he could bring evidence forward. When that didn't work fast enough, his death was arranged to look like an accident." "You're saying someone murdered him," Vincent said. We're saying the timing was suspicious and the people involved had resources to make problems disappear. Harmon paused. The evidence in that vault has given us names we've been searching for since before I joined the Bureau. This case is being reopened at the highest levels. Vincent felt the weight of what he'd accidentally uncovered settling onto him. Douglas Mercer had died protecting evidence that could expose corruption that went back 50 years, had hidden it so well that even federal agents searching the factory hadn't found it, had trusted that eventually someone would discover what he'd preserved. "Why come here to tell me this?" Vincent asked. "You've got the evidence. You can pursue your case. What do you need from me?" Elizabeth and Harmon exchanged a look that suggested this was the real reason for their visit. "The vault contained more than documents," Elizabeth said. "It also held information about assets my father set aside, money he believed would be seized if he was arrested or killed. He hid it the same way he hid the evidence, scattered it in ways that required knowledge of this building to locate." Vincent felt his pulse quicken. "You're saying there's money hidden somewhere in this factory?" "We're saying my father's ledgers reference provisions for continuation and secured assets for family recovery. He was methodical, documented everything. If he had money, he left clues about where to find it." Elizabeth met Vincent's eyes. "You own this building now. You have the right to search for whatever else my father left behind. But I'm his daughter, and I have a moral claim to understanding his final years." The request was clear. Elizabeth wanted access to the rope factory to search for clues about hidden money her father might have left, and she was offering Vincent a partnership rather than fighting him legally. But Agent Harmon's presence suggested federal interest in whatever else might be found. "If I find money hidden here, does it belong to me as the property owner or to the Mercer estate?" Vincent asked. His lawyer, a public defender named Sarachan who'd taken his case pro bono after hearing about the FBI involvement, had been clear about this. Found property on legitimately owned land generally belonged to the owner unless it could be proven stolen or connected to criminal activity. If Douglas Mercer had hidden legitimate assets, they'd likely transfer with the property. "That depends on what we find and how it was obtained," Harmon said. "If the money was legitimate earnings hidden to protect them from seizure, it probably becomes yours. If it was connected to the smuggling operation, it's evidence in a federal case." Over the next 2 weeks, Vincent found himself in an unlikely partnership with Elizabeth Mercer Whitfield, both of them searching the rope factory for clues her father had left 53 years ago. They worked methodically through the building, studying Douglas's patterns, learning how he thought about space and security and concealment. Jamie helped in ways that surprised Vincent. His son had a gift for noticing details adults overlooked, for seeing patterns in chaos. He found the first real clue, a series of marks on timber beams in the third-floor production area that looked random but followed a sequence that matched dates significant to Douglas Mercer's life. "These numbers are backwards," Jamie said, pointing to marks carved into wood that had darkened with age. "Like they're trying to tell you something but not obviously." Elizabeth studied the marks, her eyes widening. "My father's birthday, my mother's birthday, the date they married. But reversed, like a combination read right to left instead of left to right." They found the second hidden space behind a false wall in the rope storage area, a cavity that contained not money but more documents. Personal letters Douglas had written to his wife explaining what he'd discovered, what he was trying to do about it, why he was taking risks that might cost him everything. Vincent watched Elizabeth read her father's letters, saw decades of questions finding answers, saw a daughter understanding for the first time that her father hadn't been a criminal but a man trying to do the right thing in circumstances where the right path was nearly impossible to find. "He knew they were going to kill him," Elizabeth said, her voice breaking. "The last letter is dated 2 days before his death. He knew, and he still tried to protect the evidence, still believed someone would eventually find it and finish what he'd started." But it was Vincent who found the actual money, 3 weeks after buying the rope factory. He'd been exploring the basement machinery, the massive rope twisting equipment that had been the factory's industrial heart. The machines were complex assemblies of gears and drums and tensioning systems, built to last generations. Inside one of the largest machines, hidden in a maintenance access cavity that wouldn't be visible unless you knew exactly where to look, Vincent found metal cases. 4 of them, sealed against moisture, each one containing exactly $100,000 in currency from the early 1970s. $400,000 that Douglas Mercer had converted to cash and hidden in industrial equipment that had sat undiscovered for over 50 years while the factory decayed around it. Money that was legally Vincent's as the property owner, money that represented security beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd placed his desperate bid at auction. The discovery should have felt like triumph, but Vincent stood in the basement holding cases full of money and thinking about Douglas Mercer, about a man who'd died protecting principles rather than running to save himself. The money could change everything for Vincent and Jamie, could give them stability and opportunity and freedom from the desperation that had driven them to live in an abandoned factory. But accepting it meant choosing personal benefit over potential complications, meant prioritizing his own needs over questions about whether the money should go to Elizabeth or be considered evidence in a federal case. Agent Harmon arrived within hours, alerted by the monitoring equipment the FBI had installed in the building. He examined the money, photographed it, ran serial numbers through databases looking for connections to criminal activity. After 3 days of investigation, he delivered his verdict. The money appears to be legitimate earnings from the rope factory, converted to cash between 1969 and 1971. Serial numbers don't match any reported thefts or criminal proceeds. Legally, it's found property on land you own. Harmon paused. But Elizabeth Mercer Whitfield has filed a claim as Douglas Mercer's heir, arguing the money was family assets her father hid to protect them. The legal battle that followed consumed 2 months and most of Vincent's emotional reserves. Elizabeth's claim was sympathetic, a daughter seeking to recover what her father had hidden, assets that should have passed to his family rather than to a stranger who'd bought foreclosed property. Her lawyers argued that Douglas had clearly intended the money for his family, that his hiding it didn't change his ownership or his heirs' rights. Vincent's lawyer countered that found property transferred with legitimate property ownership, that Douglas's failure to inform his family about the money meant it had been effectively abandoned, that 50 years of the Mercer family owning the factory and never finding the money suggested they'd forfeited any claim. Jamie watched his father struggle with the decision of whether to fight for the money or surrender it. "Is it ours or is it hers?" he asked one evening while they ate dinner in the office space Vincent had made livable. "Legally, probably ours. Morally, I don't know." Vincent thought about Douglas Mercer hiding money to protect his family, dying before he could tell them where it was. Her father tried to do the right thing and got killed for it. The money was supposed to take care of his family, but he died before he could make sure they got it. "But we need it too," Jamie said quietly. "We don't have anywhere else to go." The simplicity of it cut through Vincent's moral uncertainty. They were both right, both deserving, both victims of circumstances neither had created. Douglas Mercer had hidden money to protect his family from consequences of exposing corruption. Vincent had bought an abandoned factory because he was desperate and homeless. Elizabeth wanted what her father had died protecting. Vincent needed what he'd legally found. The judge who heard the case was a woman in her 70s named Patricia Morrison, who'd practiced law in the county for 40 years and had seen enough property disputes to recognize complexity when it appeared. She listened to both arguments, studied the evidence, and delivered a ruling that satisfied nobody but was probably as fair as justice could manage. The money is legally Mr. Cross's as found property on land he legitimately owns. However, equity suggests that Elizabeth Mercer Whitfield has a moral claim to assets her father hid with the intention of protecting his family. Therefore, I'm ruling that the money should be split equally. $200,000 to Mr. Cross as the property owner who discovered it, $200,000 to Mrs. Whitfield as Douglas Mercer's heir. Vincent sat in the courtroom processing the decision, calculating what $200,000 meant for his and Jamie's future. Not the windfall the full amount would have been, but still more money than he'd earned in years of construction work. Enough to restore the rope factory properly, to create stable housing, to give Jamie opportunities Vincent had never had. Elizabeth approached him after the hearing, her expression complex. "I wanted it all. I won't pretend otherwise." My father died protecting that money, and I spent 50 years not knowing why. But the judge is probably right that we both have claims. I'm sorry about your father, Vincent said. Reading his letters, learning what he tried to do, I have a lot of respect for the choice he made. He chose principle over safety. It cost him his life and cost my family decades of uncertainty. Elizabeth paused. But maybe finding you, someone who needed what he left behind, maybe that's some kind of redemption for all the pain. Over the following months, as Vincent used his share of the money to restore the rope factory and Elizabeth used hers to fund a foundation in her father's name supporting whistleblowers, something unexpected developed. Elizabeth started visiting regularly, drawn to the building where her father had worked and died, helping Vincent understand the machinery and the history. She'd been 17 when Douglas died, had grown up in the rope factory, had learned the business before going to college and building a different life. Now, in her 70s, she found herself returning to the place that had defined her youth, helping preserve what her father had built. This floor is where I learned to splice rope, she said one afternoon, standing in the production area where massive machines sat silent. My father believed in teaching by doing. He'd give me projects that seemed impossible and then show me how patience and technique could accomplish what force never could. Jamie listened with the attention he gave to things that mattered, absorbing knowledge about a building that had become their home. The rope factory was transforming under Vincent's careful restoration, its toxic legacy replaced by stability, its abandoned spaces becoming livable and purposeful. But it was the revelation about Douglas Mercer's death that changed everything for Vincent's understanding of what he'd inherited. Agent Harmon returned 6 months after the legal settlement, his expression carrying news that had been 53 years in coming. We made arrests yesterday. The evidence from the vault, combined with renewed investigation, led us to surviving members of the smuggling operation Douglas Mercer tried to expose. Some of them are in their 80s now, thought they'd gotten away with it forever. Harmon paused. We also confirmed that Mercer's death was murder, not accident. The man who arranged it is dying of cancer and decided to confess as part of a plea deal. Elizabeth absorbed this confirmation of what she'd always suspected with tears she'd held for 5 decades. My father was murdered for trying to do the right thing. And the people who killed him live free their entire lives. Until now, Harmon said. The prosecutions will proceed. Justice delayed, but not denied. After Harmon left, Vincent and Elizabeth stood together in the rope factory, both of them processing the weight of legacy they'd inherited from a man who'd died protecting principles that mattered. Douglas Mercer had chosen to fight corruption even knowing it might cost him everything. He'd hidden evidence that would eventually expose his killers, hidden money that would eventually help people he'd never meet. Your father's legacy isn't the money or even the evidence, Vincent said. It's the fact that he stood for something when standing cost him his life. That matters in ways that go beyond criminal prosecutions. Elizabeth nodded, looking around the building her father had loved. He'd be glad you found this place. Glad it's being preserved by someone who understands that buildings like this represent more than profit. As evening settled over Mill Creek and the rope factory stood solid in the fading light, Vincent felt the weight of the past 6 months settle into something approaching understanding. He'd bought an abandoned building hoping for shelter and had inherited a murdered man's final testimony, had found money that had been hidden to protect family he'd never known, had become the custodian of justice that had taken half a century to emerge. The factory breathed differently now, its vast spaces holding stories that had finally been told, its hidden vaults and secret caches yielding what they'd protected. Douglas Mercer's sacrifice hadn't been in vain, his evidence had exposed corruption, his money had helped people who needed it, his building had found someone willing to preserve what he'd built. Vincent stood in the office where Douglas had once managed his operation, holding ledgers that documented both legitimate business and the investigation that had cost a good man his life. Jamie was asleep in the bedroom Vincent had built in the safest section of the factory, secure in ways that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. The money had given them stability, but Douglas Mercer's real gift was the understanding that some things were worth fighting for even when fighting carried terrible cost. That principle mattered as much as profit, that truth mattered as much as convenience, that standing for what was right sometimes meant risking everything. The rope factory waited in the darkness, its brick walls holding stories that had taken generations to reveal, its machinery silent but preserved, its purpose renewed through the choices of people who'd inherited more than property. Douglas Mercer had died protecting what mattered. Vincent had found what Douglas protected and honored the trust it represented. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you owned but what you stood for, not what you inherited but what you chose to protect when protection came at cost. The building that had been abandoned for 30 years was alive again, sheltering people who understood that some inheritances came with obligations that transcended legal ownership. The restoration of the rope factory happened slowly, deliberately, with the kind of patience Douglas Mercer would have recognized from his own approach to craftsmanship. Vincent used his share of the found money carefully, hiring local contractors who understood old buildings, investing in proper repairs rather than cheap fixes, honoring the structure's industrial character while making it safe and functional. The first priority was making the building livable for Jamie, creating spaces that felt like home rather than emergency shelter. Vincent converted the old office suite on the second floor into an apartment, installing proper insulation and heating, replacing windows with energy-efficient units that still matched the building's historic appearance. He built Jamie a bedroom with views of Mill Creek, a space that was entirely his son's after years of temporary housing and shared rooms. Jamie flourished in ways that surprised Vincent. His son had inherited his mother's artistic sensibility. She'd been a graphic designer before addiction had consumed her, before she disappeared into a life Vincent couldn't follow and Jamie couldn't remember. The boy spent hours sketching the rope-making machinery, capturing the complex beauty of industrial equipment that most people saw as junk. "These machines are like sculptures," Jamie said one evening, showing Vincent drawings that revealed genuine talent. "They were built to do specific things, but they're also beautiful in how the parts fit together." Vincent enrolled Jamie in the local school, a small building that served Mill Creek's declining population with dedication that exceeded its limited resources. The principal, a woman named Catherine Walsh who'd taught in the district for 30 years, took special interest in Jamie's artistic abilities, connected him with a retired art teacher who provided mentoring that public school budgets couldn't afford. Elizabeth became a regular presence in their lives, visiting the rope factory monthly, sometimes more often. She'd established the Douglas Mercer Whistleblower Protection Foundation with her share of the money, using it to support people who exposed corruption at personal cost. But the rope factory drew her back repeatedly, this building where her father had worked and died, where his final secrets had waited for someone worthy to find them. "I hated this place for years," she told Vincent one afternoon while they worked together cataloging the old rope-making equipment. "Blamed it for taking my father, for the investigation that destroyed our family's reputation, for everything that went wrong after his death. But being here now, helping you restore it, I'm starting to understand what he loved about it." What did he love? The craft. The fact that rope-making required precision and patience and understanding of materials. You couldn't force it or rush it. You had to work with the natural properties of fibers, twist them at the right tension, cure them properly. It was honest work that produced something useful. She paused, running her hand along one of the massive machines. "My father believed in honest work. That's why he couldn't ignore what he discovered, couldn't just look away when he saw corruption in systems that were supposed to serve the country." The criminal prosecutions played out over 2 years, a slow legal process that brought justice to men who'd thought themselves beyond reach. The smuggling operation Douglas had documented had involved high-ranking officials in military supply chains, men who'd used their positions to move contraband alongside legitimate cargo, who'd profited while soldiers died lacking equipment that had been diverted for profit. 3 men were convicted of charges ranging from conspiracy to murder. The man who'd arranged Douglas Mercer's death received a life sentence at age 84, his confession providing closure Elizabeth had sought for over 5 decades. The trials made national news, resurrecting Douglas's story, transforming him from suspected criminal to heroic whistleblower in public memory. Vincent attended the sentencing with Elizabeth, both of them witnessing justice that had taken a lifetime to arrive. Afterward, they stood outside the courthouse, processing what the verdicts meant. "My father died believing he might be remembered as a criminal," Elizabeth said. Now he's being honored as someone who sacrificed everything to expose corruption. It doesn't bring him back, but it corrects the record. He'd be proud of what you built with the foundation, Vincent said. Protecting other whistleblowers, making sure they don't face what he faced alone. And he'd be proud of what you're doing with the factory. You could have taken the money and left, could have sold the building and started fresh somewhere else. Instead, you're preserving what he built. The preservation took on additional meaning as Vincent learned more about the rope factory's history. The building had been a cornerstone of Mill Creek's economy for 90 years, had employed generations of families, had produced rope that had been used in countless applications from sailing ships to farm equipment to construction projects. Its closure in 1992 had been one more nail in the coffin of a town that had lost most of its industrial base. Local people started approaching Vincent with stories about the factory, about grandfathers who'd worked there, about rope that had lasted decades because Douglas Mercer refused to cut quality for profit. A man named Frank Dobson, who'd been one of the factory's last employees, visited one afternoon with photographs from the building's working days. "Your father ran a good operation," Frank told Elizabeth, spreading black and white images across Vincent's work table. "Paid fair wages, maintained safe conditions, treated workers like they mattered. When synthetic rope started taking over the market, he could have cut corners to stay competitive. Instead, he specialized in quality natural fiber rope for people who still valued it. The business was dying, but he kept standards high until the end." Frank turned to Vincent. "What are you planning to do with the building? It's too big for one family, too specialized for most businesses." Vincent had been thinking about this question for months, studying the factory's layout, researching what other communities had done with abandoned industrial buildings. The answer had been forming slowly, shaped by conversations with Elizabeth and observations about what Mill Creek needed. "I'm thinking about converting it to mixed use. Keep our apartment on the second floor, but open the first floor to small manufacturers or craftspeople who need affordable workshop space. The building was designed for making things, might as well honor that." Elizabeth's eyes lit up. "My father would love that. Keeping the factory as a place of production, just adapted for modern needs rather than abandoned." The vision took shape over the following year. Vincent used the remainder of his settlement money to create proper workshop spaces on the main floor, installing electrical systems and ventilation, dividing the vast production area into sections that could be rented to small businesses. He kept rental rates low, targeting craftspeople and small manufacturers who were being priced out of more expensive locations. The first tenant was a furniture maker named Sarachan, no relation to Vincent's lawyer, who specialized in custom woodworking using traditional joinery techniques. She moved into the largest workshop space with tools that looked like they belonged in a museum, her commitment to old methods echoing Douglas Mercer's refusal to compromise quality for efficiency. "These machines are remarkable," Sarah said the first time she explored the rope-making equipment Vincent had preserved. "Industrial craft from an era when things were built to last. I'd love to incorporate some of the design elements into my work, honor the building's history." Other tenants followed. A metalworker who created custom railings and architectural elements. A textile artist who wove tapestries using natural fibers. A bookbinder who still practiced traditional techniques that most of the publishing industry had abandoned. Each one brought their craft to a building that had been purpose-built for manufacturing, creating an ecosystem of makers that felt like honoring Douglas Mercer's legacy. Jamie grew up surrounded by craftspeople, learning from people who valued skill and patience and attention to detail. By age 12, he was apprenticing informally with Sarah, learning woodworking techniques, developing an understanding of how materials responded to different treatments. His artistic talent found practical application, his sketches becoming design studies for actual projects. Vincent watched his son flourish in ways that would have seemed impossible when they'd arrived in Mill Creek with nothing, desperate and displaced. The rope factory had given them shelter, but it had also given Jamie something more valuable, exposure to people who'd chosen craft over convenience, quality over quick profit, who demonstrated daily that making things well mattered even when the market didn't always reward it. Elizabeth visited less frequently as years passed, her foundation work consuming time and energy, but she remained connected to the building her father had loved. She funded a scholarship program through the foundation that brought apprentices to work with the rope factory's tenant craftspeople, creating opportunities for young people to learn traditional skills. On a warm evening in May, 5 years after Vincent had bought the rope factory at auction, they held a dedication ceremony for a memorial Elizabeth had commissioned. A bronze plaque was mounted in the main entrance, its inscription simple and powerful. Douglas Mercer, 1920–1971 master rope maker, father, whistleblower. He chose truth over safety, principle over survival. His courage exposed corruption that had flourished in darkness. This building stands as testament to his integrity and to the belief that some things are worth dying to protect. Local people attended the ceremony, some who'd worked for Douglas, others who'd known him, many who'd only heard stories but wanted to honor what he'd represented. Agent Harmon came, representing the FBI's recognition that Douglas's evidence had led to convictions that brought justice to crimes committed half a century ago. Frank Dobson spoke about working under Douglas, about a boss who demanded excellence but treated workers with dignity, who'd paid fairly even when his profit margins suffered, who'd believed that quality rope required quality materials and skilled hands willing to do the work properly. Elizabeth spoke about her father's final years, about the burden he'd carried knowing about corruption he felt obligated to expose, about his decision to compile evidence even knowing it might cost him everything. My father believed that good people had a responsibility to stand against wrong, even when standing was dangerous. He paid the ultimate price for that belief, but his evidence eventually brought justice to men who'd thought themselves untouchable. Vincent spoke last, talking about finding the factory when he was desperate, about discovering Douglas's hidden vault, about the choice to preserve rather than simply profit from what he'd found. I bought this building for $435 because I had nowhere else to go. I found money that changed my life, but I also inherited a responsibility to honor what Douglas Mercer built and what he died protecting. This factory stands today because one man believed buildings and craft and integrity mattered more than profit, and because people have continued choosing to honor that belief. After the ceremony, as people mingled and shared stories, Vincent found himself standing with Elizabeth and Jamie in the main production floor, looking at machinery that had once made rope and now stood as sculpture, as history, as testament to an era of manufacturing that had mostly disappeared. "Thank you," Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion. "For preserving this place, for honoring my father's memory, for turning what could have been just abandoned ruins into something that serves the community." "I should be thanking you," Vincent replied. "For sharing the money when you could have fought for all of it, for helping me understand your father's story, for supporting what I've tried to build here." Jamie spoke up, his voice carrying the thoughtful quality it had developed over years of learning from craftspeople. "Mr. Mercer's story taught me something important. That you can't always choose what happens to you, but you can choose how you respond." He could have ignored what he discovered, could have protected himself by staying quiet. Instead, he chose to do the right thing even knowing it might cost him everything. Elizabeth smiled, tears in her eyes. "You sound like him. My father believed that character was revealed in hard choices, that anyone could do the right thing when it was easy, but doing it when it was hard, that's what mattered." As evening deepened and people began leaving, Vincent walked the factory floor one last time, his footsteps echoing in spaces that had been filled with work and purpose for 9 decades, that had sat silent for 3, and that now hummed with renewed activity. The building had survived abandonment and decay, had held Douglas Mercer's secrets for 50 years, had yielded them to someone who'd honor rather than exploit what he'd found. The money had given Vincent stability and opportunity, had allowed him to build rather than just survive. But Douglas's real gift was the understanding that legacy wasn't about what you accumulated but about what you built, not about what you received but about what you chose to protect when protection came at cost. Frank Dobson approached as Vincent was locking up, the old man's eyes wet with memories. "Douglas would be glad you found this place. Glad it's still standing, still serving a purpose, still honoring the belief that making things well matters." He paused. "He died alone, protecting evidence nobody found for 5 decades. But because of you, his death wasn't meaningless. The building he loved is preserved, his killers faced justice, his daughter found peace. That's as close to redemption as tragedy gets. After everyone left, Vincent sat in his apartment with Jamie, both of them processing the day's wait. Through the windows, they could see Mill Creek settling into night, a town that had survived industrial decline by adapting rather than disappearing, by finding new purposes for old buildings, by honoring heritage while serving present needs. "Are we staying here forever?" Jamie asked, the question carrying curiosity rather than concern. Vincent thought about this carefully. "I don't know about forever. But for now, yeah. This place has given us stability, has connected us to something bigger than ourselves. The factory isn't just shelter anymore, it's home, it's work, it's purpose. That matters in ways that go beyond money or convenience." The rope factory stood in the darkness, its brick walls holding stories that had finally been told, its hidden vaults empty now but its legacy full. Douglas Mercer had died protecting what he believed mattered. Vincent had found what Douglas protected and chosen to honor the trust it represented. Elizabeth had transformed personal tragedy into support for others facing similar choices. That was inheritance in its truest form, not property passed down but principles carried forward, not wealth received but responsibility embraced, not the past preserved unchanged but legacy adapted to serve present needs while honoring foundational values. The building that had been abandoned for 30 years was alive again, serving craftspeople who valued quality over convenience, providing space for making rather than just consuming, standing as proof that some inheritances came with obligations that transcended legal ownership. Vincent stood at his window looking down at the production floor, watching moonlight illuminate machinery that had once twisted fibers into rope, that had created something useful through patient application of skill and pressure and time. Douglas Mercer had understood that principle, had built a business on it, had died protecting evidence that corruption existed in systems that should have valued integrity. The money Douglas had hidden had found people who needed it, had been used to preserve rather than exploit, had honored the trust its concealment represented. His evidence had brought justice to men who'd escaped it for half a century. His building stood renewed, serving purposes he would have valued even if he couldn't have predicted them. As Vincent prepared for sleep in quarters that felt permanently his for the first time in years, he thought about the journey from eviction notice to stability, from desperation to purpose, from buying an abandoned factory to building something that honored the man who'd built it originally. The rope factory breathed in the night air, patient as only old buildings could be, its walls holding memories of work and craft and the courage of a man who'd chosen principle over safety. That courage had cost Douglas his life but had ultimately exposed corruption, had protected assets that helped people decades later, had preserved a building that served community needs long after its original purpose became obsolete. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy written in brick and bronze, in honest work and hard choices, in the understanding that some things were worth protecting even when protection came at terrible cost, and that honoring those who'd paid that cost was obligation as much as opportunity. 10 years passed like rope being twisted, each strand of time adding strength to what Vincent and Jamie had built in the factory Douglas Mercer had died protecting. The building stood transformed, not through erasure of its industrial past but through careful evolution that honored history while serving present needs. The massive rope-making machines remained on the main floor, preserved as functional sculpture, their complex mechanisms teaching visitors about an era when manufacturing required craftsmanship as much as machinery. Jamie turned 17 that spring, tall and lean like his father, with his mother's artistic eye and a maturity that came from growing up among craftspeople who valued patience and precision. He'd spent a decade learning from the rope factory's tenants, absorbing skills that most of his generation would never encounter. His hands bore calluses from woodworking, stains from metalwork, small scars that told stories of learning through doing rather than just observing. "I've been accepted to the design program at Carnegie Mellon," Jamie told Vincent one evening, his voice carrying both excitement and uncertainty. "Full scholarship based on the portfolio I built here." Vincent felt pride and loss mixing in his chest. "That's incredible. When do you start?" "August. But I've been thinking about deferring a year, maybe working full-time with Sarah first, really mastering traditional joinery before I go learn modern design." Jamie paused. "Is that stupid? Delaying college to make furniture?" Your grandfather would have called it stupid, Vincent said, thinking about the father who'd pushed him towards stability and conventional success, who'd died disappointed that Vincent had chosen construction work over college. But I think it's wise. Learning craft properly takes time, and opportunities to study under someone like Sarah don't come often. Jamie deferred his enrollment, spent the year apprenticing formally with Sarah Chin, whose furniture had gained recognition among collectors who valued traditional methods. Vincent watched his son transform from talented amateur to serious craftsman, saw him develop the kind of skill that couldn't be rushed or faked, that came only through patient repetition and thoughtful attention to detail. Elizabeth visited that fall, moving slower than she had at 70 but still sharp-eyed and engaged. She was 82 now, her whistleblower foundation thriving under professional management, her father's legacy secured through the work it supported. She'd spent the decade helping people who exposed corruption, ensuring they didn't face what Douglas had faced alone. The foundation supported its 100th whistleblower last month, she told Vincent, sitting in the apartment that had become his permanent home. People in industries from defense to healthcare to finance, all of them risking careers and safety to expose wrongdoing. My father would be proud that his death led to something that protects others. He'd be proud of more than that, Vincent said. He'd be proud of how you transformed personal tragedy into purpose, how you used what happened to him to help prevent it happening to others. Elizabeth looked around the apartment, at the factory visible through the windows, at the life Vincent and Jamie had built in the building her father had loved. You've honored this place better than I could have. I was too angry for too many years, saw the factory as the thing that took my father rather than the thing he died protecting. You saw what it could become. The rope factory had become exactly what Vincent had envisioned, a hub for small-scale manufacturing and craft education. The tenant craftspeople employed apprentices, taught workshops, demonstrated that quality work still had value even in an economy that increasingly prioritized speed over skill. Visitors came from across the region to see traditional methods practiced in a building designed for manufacturing, to buy furniture and metalwork and textiles made by people who'd chosen craft over convenience. The economic impact rippled through Mill Creek. The craftspeople bought materials from local suppliers, ate lunch at local restaurants, rented housing in a town that had been losing population for decades. Their presence attracted other small businesses, artists and designers drawn to affordable space in a community that valued making things well. The downtown that had been dying slowly was reviving, not dramatically but steadily, finding new purpose in supporting creative work. Frank Dobson died peacefully that winter at 91, one of the last people who'd actually worked for Douglas Mercer. His funeral was held at the rope factory, his family honoring his wish to be remembered in the building where he'd spent 40 years making rope. Vincent spoke about Frank's stories, about how he'd helped Vincent understand what Douglas had valued, how his memories had shaped the factory's restoration. Frank taught me that buildings aren't just structures, Vincent said. They're repositories of memory, witnesses to work and relationships and the choices people make about what matters. This factory remembered 90 years of rope making, remembered Douglas Mercer's courage, remembered Frank's 40 years of skilled labor. Honoring that memory means keeping the building alive, keeping it serving purposes its builders would recognize. After the service, Frank's granddaughter Sarah, a different Sarah from the furniture maker, approached Vincent with a box her grandfather had left for him. Inside were photographs from the factory's working days, images of Douglas operating equipment, of workers collaborating on complex orders, of rope being loaded onto trucks for delivery across the country. "Grandpa wanted you to have these," Sarah said. "He said you understood what this place represented, that you'd preserve these memories better than our family could." Vincent added the photographs to the small museum he'd created in the factory's entrance area, a space that told the building's history through images and artifacts and explanatory text Jamie had written. The museum wasn't large or elaborate, just honest documentation of what the factory had been and what it had become, how it had survived abandonment through Douglas's hidden provisions and Vincent's desperate gamble. Jamie left for Carnegie Mellon that fall, his year of intensive craft training giving him foundation his classmates lacked. But he returned every few months, drawn back to the factory that had shaped him, to the craftspeople who'd taught him, to the understanding that education happened in workshops as much as classrooms. My professors appreciate what I learned here, Jamie told Vincent during a winter break visit. They teach design theory and modern methods, but I can actually make things with my hands, understand materials in ways that go beyond specifications. That came from growing up in this building, from learning from people like Sarah and Frank. Vincent had found his own equilibrium over the decade. He managed the factory's business operations, maintained the building carefully, ensured the tenant craftspeople had space and support to do their work. The money from Douglas's hidden cash had been spent wisely, invested in infrastructure that would serve for generations rather than consumed in ways that left nothing lasting. But he'd also learned to accept that some questions would never have clean answers. The money's origin would always carry uncertainty. Was it purely legitimate earnings, or had some of it been connected to the smuggling Douglas had investigated? Vincent chose to believe Douglas had been honest, had hidden only what he'd earned legitimately, but belief wasn't the same as certainty. Elizabeth helped him with this, sharing stories about her father's meticulous honesty, his refusal to cut corners or compromise standards even when it cost him business. My father would have starved before profiting from corruption. If he hid that money, it was earnings he'd worked for fairly. Trust that, because I knew him and you didn't. On a warm May morning, 15 years after Vincent had bought the rope factory at auction, they held a ceremony Elizabeth had been planning for months. The Douglas Mercer Memorial Workshop program was launching, funded by the Whistleblower Foundation, designed to bring young people to the factory for intensive craft education. The program would teach traditional manufacturing methods while providing stipends that made participation possible for students regardless of economic background. My father believed in teaching, Elizabeth said during the dedication. Believed that skills and knowledge should be passed forward, that expertise meant nothing if it died with the people who possessed it. This program honors that belief, ensures that traditional craft survives through people willing to learn it properly. The first cohort of students arrived that summer, 12 young people from across the country selected for aptitude and commitment rather than financial resources. They spent 3 months learning from the factory's tenant craftspeople, immersed in an environment where making things well was the primary value, where patience and precision were cultivated through practice rather than praised abstractly. Jamie came home from college to help teach, his own journey from desperate kid to skilled craftsman making him effective at connecting with students who felt out of place in conventional education. He understood what it meant to find purpose through making, to discover that hands-on work could be as intellectually demanding as abstract theory. Vincent watched the program succeed in ways that justified every choice he'd made over 15 years. The students learned skills that would serve them regardless of career path, developed understanding that quality required time and attention, absorbed values from craftspeople who'd chosen to prioritize work they believed in over maximum profit. Elizabeth attended the program's completion ceremony, visibly frail now but determined to see what her father's legacy had become. She watched students present work they'd created, listened to them talk about what they'd learned, heard them reference Douglas Mercer's belief that craft mattered even when the market didn't always reward it. He'd be so proud, she whispered to Vincent. Not just of the program, but of everything. The building preserved, his courage recognized, his values being taught to another generation. This is redemption for all the pain. She died peacefully 6 months later, surrounded by family, her foundation secured and thriving, her father's memory honored in ways that mattered. Her will left a substantial bequest to the rope factory's preservation fund, ensuring the building would be maintained properly long after everyone who'd known Douglas was gone. Vincent and Jamie attended her funeral in Philadelphia, met the extended Mercer family who'd grown up hearing stories about Douglas but had never visited the factory where he'd worked and died. Some of them came to Mill Creek afterward, touring the building, seeing what Elizabeth and Vincent had built from tragedy and chance discovery. Aunt Elizabeth talked about this place constantly in her final years, one of her nephews said. How finding you was like her father's final gift, how you'd honored his memory better than family could have. She died at peace, which seemed impossible for most of her life. The seasons continued their progression, each one adding layers to the rope factory's ongoing story. Students came and learned and left, carrying knowledge forward. Tenant craftspeople remained or moved on, replaced by others who valued the building's purpose. Jamie graduated from Carnegie Mellon, returned to Mill Creek, established his own furniture studio in the factory, creating pieces that merged traditional joinery with modern design sensibility. Vincent turned 50 at the rope factory, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by the building's resurrection. Former students and current tenants, community members who'd watched the transformation, even Agent Harmon who'd maintained contact over the years, occasionally updating Vincent on how Douglas's evidence continued yielding connections to corruption that had roots in the early 1970s. As evening settled and people departed, Vincent walked the factory floor alone, his footsteps echoing in spaces that had held rope making for 90 years, abandonment for 30, and renewed purpose for 15. The building had survived through Douglas's hidden provisions, through Vincent's desperate gamble, through careful preservation and adaptation that honored history while serving present needs. He thought about the journey from eviction notice to stability, from $435 to security, from desperate father to builder of something that served community rather than just personal need. The money had helped, but Douglas's real gift was the understanding that legacy was built through choices about what to protect and how to honor trust placed in you. Jamie found him there as darkness completed its claim on the day. "You okay, Dad?" "Yeah. Just thinking about everything that led here. Your mom leaving, the eviction, the auction, finding the vault, all of it. How different things would be if any of it had gone differently. Do you think about her much?" "Mom?" Vincent considered this honestly. "Less than I used to. She made her choice, and we made ours. I hope she found whatever she was looking for, hope she's alive and healthy somewhere. But she's not part of our story anymore, hasn't been for a long time." They stood together looking at machinery that had once made rope, that now stood as testament to an era of manufacturing that valued craft as much as profit. The building breathed around them, alive with purpose, its toxic past cleaned away, its future secured through foundations and programs that would outlast everyone currently involved. The rope factory had been waiting when Vincent arrived desperate, had yielded what Douglas Mercer had hidden, had given both men, one dead, one alive, chance to build something that mattered. Douglas had died protecting principles about honesty and courage. Vincent had honored those principles through choices about preservation and purpose. Elizabeth had transformed tragedy into support for others. That was inheritance in its truest form, not property passed unchanged but legacy adapted to serve each generation's needs while honoring foundational values, not wealth hoarded but resources invested in building something larger than individual benefit, not the past frozen in place but history honored through continued relevance. As Vincent locked the factory for the night and walked to the apartment that had been home for 15 years, he felt the weight of time settle into something approaching completion. Not ending, because the work would continue, because Jamie would carry it forward, because students would keep learning and craftspeople would keep making and the building would keep standing as long as people chose to maintain it. But closure on the journey that had started with negative dollars and nowhere to go, that had led through federal investigations and legal battles and slow restoration to this moment of earned peace. The rope factory stood solid in the darkness, its walls holding stories that spanned generations, its purpose renewed through people who'd inherited more than property. Douglas Mercer had hidden money and evidence, had died protecting both, had trusted that eventually someone worthy would find what he'd preserved. Vincent had found it, had honored the trust it represented, had built something that gave Douglas's sacrifice meaning beyond criminal prosecutions and recovered assets. The building that had been abandoned for 30 years was alive again, serving purposes its builder would recognize and value, standing as proof that some things were worth fighting for even when fighting came at terrible cost. That legacy lived through the choices of people brave enough to stand for principles that transcended profit. Above, stars wheeled in patterns that had looked down on this land before the factory was built, before Douglas had worked his final shift, before Vincent had placed his desperate bid, before any of the human struggles that had shaped this place. They'd continue after everyone currently alive was gone, witnessing the slow work of buildings being preserved and knowledge being passed forward and families choosing to build rather than just survive. The rope factory stood as testament to Douglas Mercer's courage, to Vincent's choice to honor rather than exploit what he'd found, to Elizabeth's transformation of grief into purpose, to Jamie's generation learning that craft and patience and quality still mattered in a world that increasingly valued speed over substance. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy written in brick and bronze, in twisted fibers and careful joinery, in the understanding that inheritance came with obligations that transcended legal ownership, and that honoring those obligations was how ordinary people built extraordinary things. The land kept its secrets still, the creek flowing past as it had for millennia, the soil remembering everything that had happened here. But it had given what mattered most, opportunity to build something meaningful, and people stubborn enough to do the building properly, patiently, in ways that honored both past and future. As Vincent prepared for sleep in quarters that felt permanently his, he thought about Douglas Mercer one last time. A man who'd chosen truth over safety, who'd died protecting evidence and assets, who'd trusted that his building would find someone who'd understand what was worth preserving. That trust had been rewarded 15 years late, but rewarded completely, through choices that honored everything Douglas had stood for. The rope factory breathed in the night air, patient as only old buildings could be, its legacy secured not through freezing time but through continued relevance, through serving new generations while remembering old values, through standing as proof that some inheritances transformed both giver and receiver into something larger than either could have been alone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.